Elellanar Ward was 22 years old when they left her for dead in the high country above Copper Ridge, with nothing but a borrowed wool coat, a folding knife her grandfather had carried through 2 winters of trapping, and $11 folded flat in the lining of her boot. She had no horse, no shelter, no compass, and no reason to expect that anyone would come looking. But what the men who left her did not know was that a half-day's walk east of where they cut her loose in a ravine, no map showed. Something had been waiting a very long time to be found. Settle in and stay close, and let us know in the comments where in the world you're watching from tonight. To understand what happened on that ridge, you have to understand the shape of the life that preceded it. Because Elellanar Ward did not arrive in the mountains by accident, and she was not soft in the way the men who abandoned her assumed. She had been born in a narrow 2-room house at the edge of a mill town called Beers Crossing, the only child of a lairess named Ruth Ward and a millwright named Thomas Ward. And for the first 9 years of her life, she had lived inside a small, steady kind of love that asked nothing of the world beyond wages, bread, and Sundays. Her father died in the winter of her 9th year of a fever that took half the men on his crew, and her mother, who had never been strong, followed him within 18 months. And Eleanor was sent up the valley to live with her grandfather on the 80 acres he had held since the war. His name was Henry Ward, and he was 63 years old the winter she came to him. A widower and a former army scout who had settled into the quiet trade of trapping small lot cattle and the occasional guided hunt for men from the cities who paid in gold coin and asked no questions. He was not a talkative man. He did not know how to comfort a child, and he did not try. What he did from the first week she stepped off the wagon with her mother's Bible and a paper sack of clothes was teach her. He taught her how to skin a mink without cutting the hide, and how to read the weather in the way the aspens turn their leaves, and how to walk on scree without breaking her ankle, and how to build a fire in the wind with wet wood by shaving down to the dry heart of a branch. He taught her to shoot a lever-action rifle at 12 and to reload her own cartridges at 14. And by the time she was 16, she could pack a mule, dress an elk, and find her way back to his cabin from any drainage within 30 meters of the ridge. He gave her one thing that she came to love above every other object she owned, and that was a small folding knife with a bone handle worn smooth as soap. The blade 3.5 inches of high-carbon steel that he had carried, strapped inside his coat through the winter campaigns of 1864, and again through his first hard years in the mountains. He gave it to her on her 17th birthday and told her in the plainest voice he had that a person who knew how to use a knife properly was never truly without a friend. She carried it every day after that. In a leather sheath she stitched herself, and she thought of him each time her hand touched the bone. Henry Ward died in the spring of Elellanar's 20th year, quietly in the chair by the wood stove, with a cup of coffee half drunk on the sill and the door standing open to a warming wind. The 80 acres passed by law to his surviving brother, a man named Marcus Ward, who lived 200 meters south, and whom Eleanor had met exactly twice, and who wrote her a single letter in a small, neat hand, informing her that the property would be sold, and that she was welcome to remain in the cabin until the sale closed, but not beyond it. She was welcome, the letter said, to keep her personal effects. She was not welcome to any share of the proceeds. She read the letter twice, folded it, put it in the tin box on the mantel, and went out to feed the chickens. Because the chickens still needed feeding whether or not she had a home at the end of the month, the sale closed in the 2nd week of August. A land agent named Bertram Hale rode up the valley on a sorrel mare with a leather satchel across his knees and a bill of transfer folded inside it. And he sat at Henry Ward's table drinking Henry Ward's coffee while he explained to Eleanor in the same small, neat hand that Marcus Ward had used that the new owner would take possession on the 1st day of September and preferred the cabin empty by the last day of August. Bertram Hale was a courteous man in the way that professional men are courteous when they have already made every decision that matters. And he did not meet her eyes when he told her that the standing timber and the 2 cows and the 4 hens and the mule had all been counted as part of the parcel and could not be removed. He allowed her the Bible, the tin box, the folding knife, her clothes, 1 wool blanket, 1 iron skillet, and the borrowed coat that had belonged to Henry Ward, and which she had been wearing since April, because her own was thin at the elbows. He allowed her, when she asked in a level voice, the small brass compass Henry had kept in the drawer under the window on the grounds that it was engraved with his initials and could be considered personal. He did not allow her the rifle. The rifle, he said, was inventory. He wrote out a receipt for the items she was permitted to keep and set the paper on the table between them and waited for her to sign it. And Eleanor signed it with the pen he offered and did not read it a second time. Bertram Hale finished his coffee, put on his hat, thanked her for her time as though she had done him a favor, and rode back down the valley in the long, slanting light of a summer afternoon. Eleanor stood on the porch until the sound of his horse was gone, and then she went inside and began to fold her clothes into the same paper sack she had arrived with 13 years earlier. She folded the wool blanket around the skillet and the Bible and the tin box, and she tied the bundle with a length of thread twine from the shed, and she slept that night on the bare boards by the stove, because the bed frame and the tick had been counted as inventory too. In the morning she walked down to Copper Ridge with the bundle over her shoulder and the folding knife in its sheath at her hip, and $11 in silver and paper folded flat inside the lining of her right boot, which was the whole of the money Henry Ward had kept in a coffee tin in the pantry, and which Bertram Hale, either through oversight or through a small private mercy, had never asked about. Copper Ridge in August was a town of dust and slow wagons and the smell of horses standing tied in the sun. And Eleanor walked its one long street with her bundle on her shoulder and looked for work in the way a person looks for water in dry country without hurry and without hope of finding it in the first place. She asked. She asked at the boarding house and at the freight office and at the small hotel run by a woman named Mrs. Doyle, who took in laundry on the side, and who told her plainly that she had 2 girls already, and no room for a third. She slept the first night behind the livery in a stall that the hustler let her have for a nickel, and she ate a piece of bread and a strip of dried beef she bought from a Mexican woman on the corner for 3 cents. And she thought about her grandfather, and about the wind on the high ridge, and about the shape of the country north of town, where she had ridden with him twice as a girl. On the 3rd morning, she heard from the hustler that a party of 4 men from the east were putting together an expedition into the high country to hunt bighorn and needed a camp hand who knew the drainages above the ridge. And she walked to the yard behind the assay office where they were loading a packer and stood at the gate until the man in charge came over to speak with her. The man in charge was named Rollins. He was heavy in the shoulders and clean in the beard, and he wore a canvas coat too new for the season. And he looked at her the way men in that country looked at a woman standing alone at a gate, which is to say, without much interest and with less courtesy. She told him she could cook, pack a mule, dress game, and find her way in country most men could not. He asked her whose granddaughter she was, and she told him. He said the name Henry Ward, the way a man says the name of a place he has heard of but never been. And after a moment, he said that he could pay her $4 for the trip and her meals, and no more, and that she would be responsible for the horses at night. Elellanar said yes without bargaining because $4 was $4, and because the high country in late August was the closest thing to home she had left. They rode out of Copper Ridge the next morning at first light, 5 riders and 8 animals, and the wind already turning in the aspens along the creek. And Elellanar rode at the back of the string, with her bundle lashed behind the cantle, and the borrowed coat rolled across her lap, and the country opening slowly out ahead of her, gray and green and blue in the distance, where the ridges climbed toward timberline. The trail followed the creek for the first 6 miles, and then broke away northwest into a series of long switchbacks that carried them up through belts of scrub oak and then Douglas fir, and then near the top of the second day into the pale open parks where the pines thinned and the grass ran ankle-deep between patches of granite. The 4 men from the east rode ahead and spoke to one another in low voices and did not speak to her at all except to ask in the evenings when supper would be ready and whether she had staked the horses well enough for the night. She staked the horses well. She cooked what she was given to cook. Bacon and beans and biscuits fried in the skillet on a fire she built from dry lodge pole in the wind. And she slept a little apart from the men with the folding knife inside the roll of her blanket and her hand near the bone handle in the dark. Because Henry Ward had told her once that a person who slept with a knife within reach slept better than a person who slept with a rifle across the room, and she had never forgotten it. On the fourth day, the men from the east told Elellanar to ride ahead and scout the head of a drainage they had chosen from a hand-drawn map that was not so far as she could see, drawn by anyone who had ever set foot in that country. She did what she was told. She rode a bay, geeling out along the shoulder of a long stone ridge, and down into a basin of dead grass and scattered spruce. And when she turned back after 2 hours to report that the drainage held no sheep and no sign of sheep, and was walled in on 3 sides by scree that no animal in its right mind would cross. The pack string and the 4 men and her bundle and her borrowed coat were gone from the place she had left them, and the tracks in the soft ground led back down the mountain, and not up. She sat the geeling a long time in the wind. She understood then in a slow, careful way that did not surprise her much that Rollins had known her name and known her grandfather's name, and had known further that a girl with no family and no rifle and no witness could disappear in that country as easily as a stone dropped into a creek. She turned the bay and rode east instead of south, because south was where they had gone, and east was where the country dropped away toward drainages she half remembered from a summer she had ridden with Henry Ward when she was 14. Toward evening, the geeling threw a shoe on a stretch of shale and came up lame within the hour, and she stripped the saddle and the blanket and the bridle from him and turned him loose and went on with the saddle blanket over her shoulders and the folding knife on her hip and the $11 still folded flat in the lining of her right boot. She walked through the night and slept a few hours at dawn in the lee of a fallen fir and walked again. And near noon of the second day of walking, she came down a narrow game trail into a ravine that was not on any map she had ever seen, and that opened at its lower end on a small flat bench of grass beside a spring. And on the bench stood a cabin. The cabin was made of squared lodgepole logs, chinked with clay and horsehair, and roofed with split shakes going silver under 20 seasons of weather. It measured perhaps 14 feet by 18. The door was of 2 thick planks pinned with wooden pegs and hung on strap hinges forged by hand, and the door stood a quarter open on a drift of pine needles that had blown in and lay undisturbed. Above the door, someone had cut a small 5-pointed star into the top log with a chisel, and the cut was old and darkened. Inside the cabin, the air was dry and cold and smelled of dust and cured pine. There was a stone hearth in the north wall, built of river cobbles set in lime mortar, and beside the hearth, a cast-iron stove of a make she did not know, its pipe intact, its damper stiff but whole. There was a plank table, a single stool, a rope bed frame without a tick, a set of shelves nailed to the west wall, and on the shelves 3 tin plates, 2 tin cups, a wet stone, a tin of matches gone to rust, a coil of hemp rope, and a leather-bound ledger with a bootlace tied around it to keep the covers shut. The floor was of wide split puncheons, worn smooth in a track from door to hearth by feet that had crossed it many times, and then at some point long ago, stopped crossing it at all. Eleanor stood in the doorway a long moment and let her eyes adjust. Then she set the saddle blanket on the table and walked the room once slowly, laying her hand on the stove and the hearth and the bedrock and the ledger. And she did not open the ledger yet because she was a hungry woman with cold feet and there was work to do first. She fetched water from the spring in one of the tin cups and drank it, and then drank 2 more. And she gathered an armload of dry twigs and pine cones from the trees at the edge of the bench and built a small fire in the stove and coaxed it up on the 3rd match from the rusted tin. And she sat by the open stove door and warmed her hands and watched the light move on the walls. When she had warmed through, she went to the shelves and took down the ledger and untied the bootlace and opened it on the table by the window. The first page was written in a careful, upright hand in brown ink gone almost to sepia, and it read, "This cabin was built by me, Josiah Merik, in the spring of 1866 on ground I found by accident and kept for myself, being at that time 39 years of age, lately mustered out of the Union Army, where I served as quartermaster clerk under Colonel Prescott in the mountain operations of 1863 and 1864, of which more further on. The pages that followed were dated by month and year, and written in the same careful hand, and Elellanar read them slowly, one finger under the lines, while the fire ticked in the stove, and the light through the window moved along the puncheons. Josiah Merik had lived in the cabin for 19 years. He had trapped marten and mink along the ravine and taken 2 elk a year and cut his own firewood, and never once, by his own account, gone down into Copper Ridge for anything he could not carry up on his back. He had written of weather and of a dog named Pilot that died in his 11th winter, and of a woman named Sarah he had loved before the war and not married and never seen again after. He had written in one long entry dated November of 1884 that his heart had begun to trouble him, and that he did not expect to see another spring, and that he was therefore setting down in the back of the ledger certain matters he had carried alone for 20 years, and that he wished if any decent person should find this book to be finally set down, where they might do some good. Elellanar turned to the back of the ledger. The last written page was dated the 2nd week of December, 1884, and below it the pages were blank, and behind the last blank page, sewn into the binding with waxed linen thread, was a folded square of oiled paper. She cut the thread with the folding knife and unfolded the paper on the table, and inside were 3 things: a hand-drawn map of the ravine and the ground above it marked in Josiah Merik's careful hand with a small inked X at the base of the hearth. A sealed letter addressed in the same hand to whoever finds this being a person in need, and folded once a smaller sheet on which was written in a different older ink and a different blockier hand: Inventory of stores cached at Site 9. Prescott Detachment, Spring 1864. Elellanar set the 3 papers side by side on the table and read the small inked X on the map, and then she stood up from the stool and went to the hearth and knelt on the puncheons in front of it. The river cobbles at the base of the hearth were set in a course of lime mortar like the rest, but the mortar in one section, no bigger than a dinner plate, was of a slightly paler color and slightly finer grain, as though it had been mixed and laid at a later time by the same hand. She worked the point of the folding knife into the seam, and, patient as a woman shelling peas, chipped the mortar out of the joints one by one. When she had loosened the section, she lifted out 4 cobbles and set them aside on the puncheons, and beneath them, in a shallow box lined with tin and closed with a plank lid, lay the cash. There was a canvas sack heavy in her hands and stitched shut, and when she cut the stitches, gold coins ran onto the plank floor with a small dry sound. Double eagles by the look of them, more than she could count on a first glance, and enough that she stopped counting and set them aside. There was a second, smaller sack of silver dollars. There was an oilcloth-wrapped bundle of paper currency, banded and dry. There was a folded army map printed and then annotated in pencil showing a section of country she recognized as the drainages north of Copper Ridge, with numbered sites circled in a hand that was not Josiah Merik, and there was a bundle of dispatches tied with red string, and underneath all of it, wrapped in a square of blue wool that had once been part of a uniform coat, lay a small brass compass. Elellanar lifted the compass out and turned it over in her palm, and on the back of the case, engraved in a small, even script, were the letters H.W., and below them, the date 1863. Elellanar did not touch the gold that night beyond what had spilled. She gathered the coins back into the sack, replaced the tin box within the box, set the 4 cobbles back over it without mortar, and laid the blue wool square across them. She put the brass compass in the pocket of Henry Ward's borrowed coat, where her hand could find it without looking, and she slept on the rope-strung bed frame with the saddle blanket beneath her and the wool blanket over. In the morning she began, in the patient order her grandfather had taught her to make the cabin fit to live in. She swept the puncheon floor with a broom she made from spruce twigs bound to a peeled stick with a length of the hemp rope. She scraped the old ash from the stove, brushed the pipe from the inside with a wire she straightened from a nail, and reset the damper so it swung true. She chinkticked the 2 gaps in the north wall with fresh clay dug from the spring bank and worked with horsehair pulled from the underside of the abandoned saddle. She rehung the door true on its strap hinges by cutting a shim from a shake and driving it under the lower pin. She rerung the bed frame with a length of the hemp rope woven in the pattern Henry Ward had once shown her on a winter evening when she was 12, and she filled a new tick with dry meadow grass, cut with the folding knife, and dried on the roof shakes for 3 days. On the 6th morning, Elellanar walked down out of the ravine with 4 double eagles in a small pouch inside her boot, beside the $11, and with the annotated army map folded flat inside the leather ledger, and with the brass compass in her coat pocket. She came into Copper Ridge in the middle of a Thursday, went first to the marshal's office, and gave the marshal, whose name was Owen Bram, aged 51 and a widower hour of 9 years, a plain and unadorned account of being sent to scout an empty drainage and returning to find the packer gone. Owen Bram wrote it down in a green book, asked her twice to repeat the name Rollins, and told her he had suspected the party from the east of business other than sheep. He said he would ride out, and he did. From the marshal's office, Eleanor walked to the land office and paid a filing fee of $1.75 to record a homestead claim on the ravine and the bench above the spring, the ground being unentered on any patent book Bertram Hale had ever seen. The clerk was a thin man named Judd Anley, aged 34, who wore a green eye shade and asked no questions past what the law required. She walked from the land office to the mercantile of Mrs. Doyle's cousin, a man named Nate Purvis, aged 46, who ran the store and kept a fair scale, and there she changed one of the double eagles into working coin without answering where it had come from. And Nate Purvis did not ask. She bought flour, salt, coffee, lard, 6 boxes of matches, a second wool blanket, a small axe, a whetstone finer than the one on the shelf, and a used single-shot rifle with a box of cartridges. She arranged for a packer and a mule to be delivered as far as the trailhead by a freighter named Hollis Ma, aged 59, who had known Henry Ward and who charged her half of what he charged a stranger. Word traveled the way word does in a town of one long street. Mrs. Doyle came out of the hotel as Eleanor passed with the flour on her shoulder and set a tin plate of biscuits and cold ham into her free hand without a word said, and Eleanor ate them walking. An old woman named Ida Fenn, aged 72, a Laris who had known Ruth Ward when Ruth Ward was a girl, brought to the livery a folded flour sack apron and 2 dresses of her own daughter's that no longer fit anyone, and left them tied with string on Elellanar's saddle. A blacksmith named August Peel, aged 40, shot the packer and the mule and refused payment beyond a cup of coffee, saying only that Henry Ward had once shot a horse of his in a snowstorm for nothing, and the account had been open a long time. Owen Bram rode in on the 9th day with Rollins, and 2 of the 4 men from the east tied wrist to saddle, the 3rd having run into a country he did not know and not come out, and Owen Bram gave Eleanor back her paper sack of clothes, her mother's Bible, the tin box, and Henry Ward's iron skillet, all recovered from a room above a saloon in a town 2 valleys south. Eleanor moved back up to the ravine before the first snow. She cleared the bench above the spring of downed timber with the small axe, cut and stacked 4 cords of lodgepole for the stove, and built a lean-to shed of peeled poles against the south wall of the cabin for the mule and the packer. She rode down to Copper Ridge on the 1st Saturday of every month, and she came to be expected. Nate Purvis kept for her a running account and a small ledger of his own. Mrs. Doyle kept for her a room she never used, but which was understood to be hers if weather held her over. Ida Fenn kept for her on a shelf above the wash tubs a bar of hard soap wrapped in brown paper against her next visit. In the 2nd spring, Owen Bram rode up the ravine himself with a paper in a leather case and handed her the patent to the 160 acres of the bench and the ravine floor, signed and stamped, and drank a cup of coffee at Josiah Merik's plank table before he rode down again. Elellanar began quietly to guide. Hunters came out of Copper Ridge in the fall, men who wanted elk and moo deer, and asked at the livery for someone who knew the drainages above the ridge, and the hustler, whose name was Ephraim Doss, age 63, sent them to her by name. She charged $4 a day and her keep, the same figure Rollins had once offered her, and she was worth it. And the men from town who had once ridden past her in August without seeing her now took off their hats when they met her on the street. Judd Ansley at the land office recorded in his careful hand a second filing in the 3rd year, this one for grazing rights on the park above the ravine, and asked after her stovepipe by way of greeting. The cabin that Josiah Merik had built alone in the spring of 1866 had, without ever ceasing to be his, become hers as well. Warm in the coldest months, orderly in every season, and known by name to every person who mattered in the country between Copper Ridge and the High Divide. On a windless evening in the 4th year, Elellanar sat at Josiah Merik's plank table by the light of a kerosene lamp she had bought from Nate Purvis for $1.25, and she opened the sealed letter she had first opened by that same window on her second morning in the cabin and had read every winter since. The paper had gone soft at the folds, and she handled it now the way a person handles a thing that has been read enough times to become part of the reader. The letter was written in a plain, careful hand, and it said, "I am Josiah Merik, formerly quartermaster clerk of the Prescott Detachment, latterly trapper and solitary man of this ravine for 19 winters. I am setting down that in the spring of 1864 I was ordered to cache a portion of army stores and specie against a movement that never came, and that when the war ended and no man came for them, I judged the ground safer under my hand than under the hand of any officer I knew. I have added to what was left a portion of my own trapping money. Over the years, being a man with no wife and no child and no near kin, I have kept also a brass compass belonging to one Henry Ward, scout, who left it in my keeping the night of the second river crossing, and who did not return in time to reclaim it, and whom I have hoped every year to find and could not. I leave these things to whoever finds this, being a person in need, and I hope only that they use what is here to make themselves a life such as I was not able to make, and that they think kindly of an old clerk who tried to do a decent thing with what he was given." Elellanar folded the letter along its worn creases and set it back inside the ledger. She took from her pocket the small brass compass with HW and 1863 engraved on its back, and she set it on the plank table beside the folding knife with its bone handle and its 3.5-inch blade of high-carbon steel, and she looked at the two objects a long time in the lamplight. Henry Ward had carried the knife strapped inside his coat through the winter campaigns of 1864 and had given it to her on her 17th birthday. And Henry Ward had carried the compass through the second river crossing and had left it in the hands of a quartermaster's clerk he had known for perhaps a week. And Josiah Merik had kept the compass for 20 years without ever finding the man to return it to. And the compass had come down to her through the hands of two men who had in their separate ways loved her without ever knowing she would exist. The men who had ridden away from her at the head of an empty drainage had thought they were leaving a girl with no witness in country she could not walk out of. What they had left her to was her own country and her grandfather's country and Josiah Merik's country. And the ground had held for her patient as a stone everything a decent man had once tried to save. Elellanar Ward was 22 years old and had been left for dead in the high country above Copper Ridge. She had a borrowed wool coat, a folding knife, and $11 folded flat in the lining of her boot, and with them she walked into a ravine that was not on any map, and came out of it a woman with a patent, a trade, a table of her own, and a name that men in town took their hats off to. It was the best $11 she ever carried. If this story stayed with you, if you sat inside that cabin with Elellanar by the light of the kerosene lamp and felt the weight of the folding knife and the small brass compass on the plank table between her hands. Take a moment before you leave us and tap the subscribe button and share this story with someone who has ever been counted out, dismissed by a letter written in a small, neat hand, or told that a place they had helped make was no longer theirs to stand in. It costs you nothing, and it helps these long, quiet stories find their way to the people who need them, and it helps us keep telling them at the pace they deserve to be told. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from tonight, whether you are sitting by a wood stove yourself or in a city apartment or somewhere on the road between one life and another. And tell us the name of the person in your life who was your Henry Ward. The one who taught you to shave a branch to the dry heart, or to read weather in the turning of a leaf, or simply to sit still until you knew what to do next. And then, before you close the window and go on with your evening, sit for a moment with this question and answer it honestly to yourself, if to no one else. What have you been carrying quietly in the lining of your own boot that you have not yet spent? And what ravine, unmapped and waiting, might you walk into if the road you thought was yours were closed behind you tomorrow? Because the ground remembers and it keeps, and now and then, for the person patient enough to look, it gives back what a decent stranger once tried to